Hello everyone and welcome to Getting Started with Lightning 3, the basics of SolidJS. I want to create a video going over this Medium article that I wrote, and that way I can give visualizations to everything that's going on in this article. Hopefully you took a chance to read this article because it takes about as much time to write this article as it does to create this video. But I really want to go through each of the topics on here and kind of talk through it a little bit more and demonstrate it live via this video. So hopefully you'll learn some things, add some comments for more questions and more ideas for videos. Happy to create a few more. But let's get started. So here we go. We got the basics of Lightning. And the first thing is this quick start, which is just copying the solid starter template. I'm going to go through that in a little bit. But if you want a real big application that you can sink your teeth into and kind of figure out all the ins and outs of different things, I recommend you check out the Solid Demo app right here. And it has a link right here that you can actually open up and play with it live without having to download it or run it. And this is just your TMDB app where you can go through and click on different things. So here we have entity page, go through cast and crew, see different people, different things happening. Also, there is example section, which has a whole bunch of how do I do this, how do I do that. It goes through like the Flex implementation and the different properties that exist on there. I'm just hitting the backspace button to go back to the menu, but you can go through and check out the different examples. A few of these are copies of what you can find in Blitz as well, just to show, one way of doing it versus the other way of doing it. And here we have like their TMDB app version, which has like the different effects of bigger hero poster arts. Here it shows the text when you focus it. But again, this is like to give you ideas of how to do more complicated things using the SolidJS integration. Here's one of my favorite new examples, which I'm just going to go through, is this fade out effect on an element. This is using onDestroy, which basically keeps a node alive and allows you to kind of duplicate it or clone it. So that way you can have a fade out effect while a new element has an onCreate to kind of show you a new version of it. And this allows you to keep one instance, change the data, and allow you to kind of do an animation between the two. All right, and with that, we're going to get back into this article. So I will close out these two tabs, and we can go through. Now we went through the solid demo, and we're going to talk about what's going on in the solid starter template. So I have that open right here. If you do the initial steps of this clone, it will actually copy it, create a new folder called my app. You can cd into my app, do a npm install or a pnpm install, whichever one you want, and then npm start it. So that's what I have here. I have VS Code open on the right. I already npm started it, and then here's what's actually happening on the left, which is this window comes up. Unfortunately, it's not centered. Well, it is centered on the screen, but here we can move this over. That's what you'll see when you get started. And the starter template is basically the demo app, but you don't have to delete all the little pages and stuff to make it clean so that you can actually build your own app. But feel free to go into the demo app and copy things out and then come back to here. And so right now it shows you basically some text layout and then this main menu with a hello world. And I added an SVG of the solid logo just for fun. So here is our entry point into the app, is this index.tsx, and this is covered in the article, but there's this config section, and the basic config section, these are options passed directly to the Lightning 3 renderer. And again, how Solid works, how Blitz works, is they are both frameworks on top of the official Lightning 3 renderer. And the Lightning 3 renderer is really the thing that's doing all the drawing to the canvas element, does all the complicated things of making sure text renders correctly, etc. And it gets instantiated here. We can pass in whatever options go to the renderer. You pass it in directly here. So this is a little confusing, but it's the syntax that is for the renderer. And we have an inspector mode turned on. You can change the logical pixel ratio. So this is kind of an important feature for different TV resolutions. Right now I have it set to 1, so it will fix the resolution to 1080p. But if you are on a 720p, you're going to want to lower the resolution to this. And And chances are you never want to go 1080 or 4K. So this would be 4K as you would put it to 2. Mostly because most TVs will render your UI in 1080p mode. And you don't want that extra processing power over it. All right, so this is the config. We also have a debug mode that you can turn on, which just gives you a lot of console.logs. You probably won't want that. But there's also this focus debug flag, which we can set to true. And that will actually give us a border around everything to show focus, which I have to find out why it's not right now. There should be a border around that. So I will look into that at some point. Actually, I just have to save, I think. Saving, there we go. So focus debug gives us this ability to see what element actually has focus on the screen, which is this text area. And then you'll see it also goes up the focus tree. You can see it on the outside is a little light red to show like the focus path in the focus tree, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But this is the config section. And then we have the router that we're using. And the router is the official SolidJS router. It's not custom written or anything. We are literally using the SolidJS router. The router that is available from Solid is amazing. It has tons of features. It's super performant, but you can read through the official documentation on how to use it. I will give you a couple pro tips as we go back in here, which is one, I'm using the hash router. And then you have a root, which this app is your root container. So every page runs through the app component. So here's our app component, and this is just essentially in a container where we can have top-level key handlers happening. And then props.children is your page that's going to go into here. But you could do a background on here. You could add a left nav. You do whatever you want, and it's your top-level container for all your subpages. Another thing that you can do is, let's say you have some pages which have a left nav and some pages that don't. What you can do is you can have a route, which would be like /main here. And then you could have a sub route, like a child of this. Let's see how good my live coding skills are. So we could have an end route here, and we could have this be /, and then you could put this be a left nav wrapper, and that would contain your left nav, and then only this hello world page would have the left nav, and you can have these other pages not have a left nav. So really look into how you nest routes and components. It's a really useful feature that I've used before on apps, so highly recommend it. And it all works fairly well. I got to get that back to /. There we go. And so this is the router. It has this root, which is the first thing, and then the component is what component do you want to load in. We'll talk about that in a little bit. The other thing I recommend is there's this preload function, which allows you to make API calls as a separate file, as a function, and then it gets passed into the hello world page or whatever page you have. So you could have a loader for home, and then this would just be a function which gets executed when someone navigates to this route. You can make API calls through it, and then inside of hello world, it would receive props, and then props would have a data property, props.data, and props.data contains whatever you return from that function. So it's very useful for making API calls and kind of passing it in and separating your API from your UI layer. We're not going to cover that in this video, but I did want to mention that. All right, so that covers our router. And now we're at the point where we can go into Hello World and kind of build something. So here is a sample page. The Hello World of all apps, right, is just this little bit of code. And it gives us our solid SVG. And we're centering it on the page. We have a text, which is receiving focus. That just says Hello World. And then we can have another text. Now, one of the important things about JSX syntax is you can only return one element. So you can use fragments. So this is just a fragment, it's called, which basically gets removed when this gets returned. It gives you an empty wrapper, basically. But if you had one view, you could just return one view. You don't always have to do this little fragment. And then there are two primitives. That's all that you need to build everything. We have the view primitive, which corresponds to the solid render or the Lightning 3 renderer create node. And then you have the text element, which corresponds to Lightning 3's create text node. Yep, I believe those are the two underlying functions. And that's it. You can create a node, which is basically rectangles, images, different containers, and then you can put text on the screen. Now, the great part about Solid and the starter template is you'll notice everything is TypeScript by default. I don't really have an option to turn it off. You don't have to use TypeScript, but I highly recommend it because if you do, you can start writing stuff and you'll get all this nice completion here. We can use the mount property. We can say 0.5. I also have Codium going, which is giving me AI and auto completion suggestions. And the other great part is you can hover over the different properties. It will give you all this documentation. Shout out to Frank Wendell about creating all this documentation and doing all this TypeScript inside of the renderer, but all this kind of passes through to us. And so each of the properties that you put on here go directly to the Lightning 3 render. Some of them are shortcuts, which give you a little nicer thing, but a lot of these width, height, X, Y, they all just kind of flow right through to the renderer and set up your different positioning on there. Same thing with text is we get auto completion. So there's different properties on here that are also different that are not available on a view component, like font family, font style, font weight, which is bolding. Like I think we default into the solid starter template to Roboto, which I should talk about that in a second. But every text element inherits from these default font settings. So rather than on every text element having to put font family Roboto, it will automatically add this property to every one and set a default color for every text element that you create. And we also could probably set a default font size. So let's do that real quick. I think the default font size is like 50. I'm gonna make that 24. So now if I don't specify a font size, it will kind of use that fallback. All right. And with that, I'm going to go back to the Medium article. And we are going to go through this kind of step by step. I think I covered a lot of this already using the router. Focus management, we got to talk about that for a second. So let's talk about that. So inside of our app, which is our top level container, you'll notice these initial hooks. So the use focus manager is what sets up focus management is the simplest way, which will be easier to see when we start creating buttons. But right now what you have is you have the keys that get pressed. So if the letter A is pressed, it's going to call on announcer on the components. So this basically creates these little shortcuts on announcer, on last. So this is the keyword that you want to use for it. And then this is the key that gets pressed, which will trigger this. And it takes an array for if you have multiple key presses or different keys that you want to handle it. You can put whatever key code you want in there, and it will go to that one named thing. So one left, one right, one up, one down. I mean, these you probably don't have to change unless certain remotes have different key codes. But that should be basically the same across a few different ones. Use mouse gives us mouse interaction. So for LG's Magic Remote, that is available. And we have an announcer for accessibility. So if you press the letter A, it will do text to speech and gives you some useful help, for visually impaired users. And that is about it. We could turn on and off the announcer with debug, but let's now jump back into the article. So we went through all of this startup and we went through a little bit of the power of JSX and kind of building things, view and text. And now we're going to go into building our first button. So I'm going to move this over to the side here. That way we can just focus on the code. And I'm going to start copying and pasting things from the article into the editor. And we can kind of see what effect it has. So we're going to go into this hello world. And again, since we have one top level view, I can do this, I can save it. We're not using the styles right now. And here's our button. It is at the top left of the screen. And let's move it over a little bit. Let's set the X equal to 100, Y equal to 100. That sounds great. And that's it. This is a button. So we have a view, which is our outer container that's blue right now. We put a color on it. That's why it's blue. You can use this hex notation. I have this nice think this is part of VS Code, so you don't need a plugin to do this, but you can kind of change the color if you want to, and everything just kind of works, which is great. And then there's border radius, which is what gives it the rounded corner. And we specify a height and a width, and we just put some hello world in there. Text align center, contain both. That's what makes it centered, because we have the same width as the parent container. And this is your hello world button. But obviously this isn't that useful, right? Like we want a reusable button. So let's figure that out. But before we do, I just want to mention that everything inside of Lightning is position absolute. That's how I think about it. I came from a web HTML div background. So you can imagine every view that you put on there is a div, and you're setting it position absolute by default. Everything's position absolute. And then you're setting it, what's my XY coordinate? So this is your basically top and left offset for every single component that you write. And that moves it around and puts it in different places. Okay, so let us make a reusable button. And here we're just going to create a function. And we're not going to export it. We're just going to leave it right in here for simplicity. But now we have a button, and it's not used yet. So let's actually use it. I was hoping this autocomplete would be a little bit better. Hello world. Hello there. Let's change it to hello there. So now our button has updated. We now have hello there, and we just have a simple button. And the great part about JSX and the syntax here is everything is just a function. So this is a function, it's going to pass in props, and you're returning some JSX markup. And the cool thing is you pass in props, we can put whatever props we want on here. So let's put our X back and our Y back. And you don't have to specify X and Y because it's going to spread them. So whatever props here that you don't care about, or the default props, they can just be passed in and spread onto view. And this way you don't have to specify every single option that exists for the view component. You can just spread it, which is great. Now, the other thing that you have to know is, let's say we want to change the width. And we say width is 200, height is 100. I just saved that. You'll notice it didn't actually change, and that's because we set defaults here. So these defaults overwrite what is in the props. So if you wanted to do that, you'd have to do props.width or 300. So now you'd see that it updated, it went to 200 because that's what we passed in. And this is just how props and everything work, but there's a better way, an easier way to do it, which we will talk about in 1 second. I just want to emphasize that we have a button here, and we can actually put a container around this. We can put 2 buttons. Save that. We'll put a second button. And again, this is just a reusable button. We can put as many buttons as we want up there. Let's make it a little bit better. And one of the things that I really like about Solid is this ability to do styles. So here we're going to create another button. And we're going to use styles. And again, this could be in a separate file. It doesn't have to be inline. You can do it in another file and then just import it. But here we're going to create a button, and instead of having all those inline props, we're going to use button style. We're going to use the style, and the style takes an object. There's a few important things, kind of important, but not necessarily too important, performance things, which is I'm creating the button style outside of the function, because if I did it inside of here, it would create this object every single time you created a button. So I have it outside, so that way this button style can be reused. It doesn't have to recreate this object every single time. So it's a little bit of a performance benefit to kind of have your styles outside of there. And you can put these in a separate file and import your styles. Like, it gives you the flexibility of CSS in JS, which a lot of web developers are used to, here with this. And then you can, of course, combine styles by doing, just ... spread your other styles into this style if you have some default styles, but it gives you a lot of flexibility. Okay, so now that we have our button, the other benefit that styles does is I can have width and height on here. And whatever I pass in or whatever I set here is now the default. So now it's using the passed in version rather than the ones I specified on here. Because how the style object works is it checks for existing properties before applying these properties. And the other cool part, if you came from Lightning 2, is the order of these properties doesn't matter anymore. So it used to be that you had to do it in a specific order because the order of which you put them on there is the order that they get applied. But with the style object now, it always applies it last. So it checks if the property is on there, and if it is, it won't actually put this property on there. So it uses these properties that are being passed in, which we don't necessarily have to specify a width and a height here, but let's change this up just to make it look a little pretty. But you can see how it's changing, it's updating, and we have an updated button, and we got a style tag. We'll have to figure out that out. So sometimes TypeScript doesn't like the style object. What you have to do is you have to say as const here, and that will usually fix up TypeScript so that you have specific properties. And then our props.children, which is coming in, we just have as this text, so it's coming in and being our text for the button. Okay, and again, anything that you put inside of your JSX is your props.children. And you only want to access that once. If you are going to use it multiple times, check out the children helper under SolidJS. All right, so now we have a button, a reusable button. But one problem that we have is, let's see if we made this button a little bit smaller. There we go. Okay, it's not truncating yet because we don't have contain on the text. Or maybe we do. But our button style and our text style is both the same thing. So one of the issues that we have is that our text isn't updating based on the width that we're getting back here. So what we could do for our text is we could say the width of this equals props.width. Yep, I think that will do it. Because then if this is undefined, it should still use the text style.width. And so now, since we're using contain both, and we're setting a width on here, what it does is the Lightning renderer actually truncates the text. So now we get this ... effect. But obviously, if we're creating a button, we kind of want them to resize a little bit based on the content that's coming in, because we don't know how big the content is a lot of times. And this is where we're gonna use Flex. And Flex is one of the most powerful features of the Solid integration with Lightning. I highly recommend you read the full documentation that's available for it. But let's change our button a little bit. So we'll change some of these styles, change our button. So I'm just gonna replace these styles. Save that. And now you'll notice that our button style has display flex here. And we set a height. We don't set a width because Flex is going to auto-calculate our width based on the size of the text. The other thing that we have is our text component. We have a margin on it, margin left and a margin right. And this allows us to kind of add padding to the side. So if I remove the margin left, you'll save it. You'll see that it starts right at the edge. But instead, like you want to have a little padding in there, you can do margin left and margin right. And this again gives us now a dynamically sized button based on the width and height of the text that's being passed in. I'm just going to remove the width and height here. We're going to go, hello there, my name is Chris. Save that. We're going to get rid of this other button so that we can see it over top of there. But now we have one button that is just resizing automatically based on the width of the text. You'll also notice here that there is no JavaScript, like no imperative JavaScript. You don't have to do any callbacks. You don't have to do anything. Like the text is just automatically, or the container's automatically sizing based on the text. So the less JavaScript you have to write, the better. You really want your UIs just to kind of like auto work with what's being passed in. All right, so that is our Flex, but we should probably look at it in a little bit more complicated of an example with multiple buttons. One of my favorite ones to kind of demonstrate, which I'm just going to bring back a Medium article that's a little bit easier than to go through this, is this also works. So here we have text, we have an image, and then we have more text. And you can just put this in a flex container with flex direction row, which is the default, and it will lay out the text. It will put the image next to the text wherever it ends, and then put the other text right next to it as well. So it's automatically spacing it because it's in a flex container. And this is really powerful, especially if you're using different languages, because you have no idea how big the text is because the size changes based on what you're actually communicating. So here, even if you change the language and size, the flex container will just automatically update with the new size and everything just works. So really powerful stuff. I highly recommend you use the flex. Use the flex, not the force, but you can use the force with the flex. Fun jokes there for all you Star Wars fans. All right, so let's continue on and make our button do something with some signals. Okay, so we're going to import create signal from SolidJS. Boom. So now we have a signal. We always get this little squiggly because it's like, you're not using this yet. I'm like, thank you. I know that. I just imported it. And here is our button. I think we're still using this button, but we're just going to update this code. This. Boom. And now I have the focus debug on there, which is why it's showing red. So this button currently has focus. And the reason it has focus is because I added an autofocus attribute on there. And the autofocus, this works the same as DOM elements. If you just put the key on there, it's the same thing as passing in autofocus true. So it just sets autofocus to true. And you want autofocus on one element on your page. Every time you come into a page, there should be one element that has the autofocus property. And what happens is when the node is created, the framework is automatically going to call set focus on this element. So you don't have to do anything manually. This button is receiving focus as soon as it gets created. Again, don't put autofocus on every single component. Only put it on one element that you want to have the initial default focus. And so now that our button has focus, we can have an on-enter key handler. And this on-handler is just an arrow function, which is changing a signal, just toggling the signal from true to false, false to true. So this passes in the previous value, and then you can return a new value. And so now we have a button, and we said based on whether it's a favorite, display the text unfavorite or favorite. So here's our signal. This is all the same stuff. If you read the SolidJS documentation, you are using it basically verbatim. So how it uses signals, like you are using signals here. There is no different. You can read through all the documentation in SolidJS, which I highly recommend, and you can use basically 99% of the features that SolidJS make available. Just the stuff that works with only HTML and CSS, which there's very little. Like those are the things you're not obviously using. But here we have a button, we have one enter. So I'm going to hit enter over here, and you'll notice that the text changes. You'll also notice that since it's a flex container, it automatically resizes the button too. So really cool stuff, just hitting enter, going back and forth. And yeah, I mean, it's pretty awesome. So I want to spend just a minute talking about debugging, right? Like what if it doesn't work, or what if something's wrong? So I'm going to open up the inspector. And I have the inspector on. So here is inspector, it's being passed in. You need the inspector to also use focus debug. And what the inspector does is it adds HTML elements on top of the canvas. So to be very clear, Lightning 3 creates a canvas tag, and everything that you see on the screen is inside of the canvas. And the inspector, what it does is it says for every node, I'm going to create a div that's just a rectangle. Like, so these aren't actually, they don't have anything in them. They're just divs representing where stuff is on the screen based on the width and height and X, Y that you put out here. So here's our button, and I can select it here. And there's my favorite button. This is the text element inside of there, which has a really big height. We should probably set some kind of height on here. And the cool part that you can do with this is you can click on the divs. So this would be my button. This would be my text. And inside of the console, you can do $0, which is the div. And then you can do $0.element. This gives you the Lightning node. It gives you the underlying, actually, no, this gives you the SolidJS node from the integration. So this is the SolidJS node. You can do .lng. that gives you the core Lightning node. But usually you just want to use $0.element. But here, now I can say, what is the text? I can change the text to banana. That's a hard word to spell. I can hit enter. So now it just changed the text. It automatically updates. I can change the X value to 500. Like, you can manipulate anything you want on here, which gives you the ability to debug, to make changes, kind of tweak things a little bit to figure out what the value is that you actually need to put inside of your code. But definitely use this $0.element to kind of see where things are on the screen and to manipulate it. The other thing is, like, it gets a little tricky because you're like, well, this ID, it's a randomly generated ID. So what we can do to fix that, we go back into our hello world. We can put an ID on here of, let's call it my button. Make it a little better. And now you'll see, let's see, this should have food. Well, this should have an ID of my button on here. Oh, yep, yeah, it should have an ID of my button. So I'll have to look into why that isn't happening. It should have a data-ID of my button. But there is a data object that you can also put on here. So we could do data equals my button. See if this works. So now we're going off script, which is always tricky. And that's double squiggly brackets. So we go like that. But this is kind of a useful feature. Why I'm spending some time on it. Yeah, this should have a data-ID. All right, so I will continue looking at that and get back to you with that on the next video about debugging a little bit more critically. Let us continue. We'll get rid of the debugger. Yeah, the problem with videos is there could be live questions, which would be very interesting to ask. But this is all that I have for you. We have an on enter that we're changing this from true to false, and it's just updating the text. So let us continue through the article a little bit more. And, you know, one of the problems that we have now is this button, like, we don't know that it has focus unless we actually change the UI and change the look of it. So let's actually do that real quick. And we're going to do that by updating our button style. Here's our current button style. We're going to update this. I'm like looking at the code that I put in here, and this one now doesn't have display flex on it, which is problematic. So I'm just going to copy and paste in some of the styles in there. We definitely want the clicking the wrong things. Okay, so here we have display flex still. We still have our button, and what we did was we added a focus property in our style object, and this only works in the style object. But when this element receives focus, it's going to set its alpha to 1, and it's going to scale it to make it a little bit larger, to 1.1. Whenever you use these states, so focus is a state, you have to have the default values specified on the original. So like when it loses focus, it's going to go back to alpha 0.8 and a scale of 1. And we also have a transition on here, which means it's going to animate the alpha from the previous value to the new value and vice versa. And here we're using the shortcut, which is just true. This will use whatever the default animation is that you specified. But let's look at how this works by actually having two buttons, or actually right now it has focus. I'm going to remove the autofocus property, which is probably the easiest way to kind of change it. So there you see it went, it changed the alpha and it scaled it down a little bit. I'm going to put that back. Now it's scaled up and changed the alpha. And that, again, is all happening at the integration level. Since it has focus, the framework actually goes through, finds this focus thing, applies these properties, and since it has a transition, it will actually do the animations between the two as well. So let's actually see this in action by checking out a more complicated example with a few more buttons. So here I should be able to copy in all of this stuff from the last example. We have a new hello world. So we're just going to replace this from the article. We have a little bit new imports from Solid UI. So the Solid UI library has a bunch of useful components that I highly recommend that you check out. We don't need the signal anymore right now, but we'll leave that in just in case. And we are also using the for element from, nope, not from Solid. We're using that from SolidJS. The other thing, you'll note that this worked even though we didn't import for, and that is because the JSX template stuff from SolidJS is automatically imported in Vite. So you don't necessarily have to import it, but it's ideal for you to import these different keywords like for, index, show, and just use it as you would with any other component. All right, so here we go. We have our favorite. We have SolidJS, we have Lightning, Rocks, and you'll also notice that every time I've been changing the code, I just save and it auto reloads. So there's hot module reloading here. As you make changes, you just see the changes on the screen. And here we go. So we have an array of buttons that we just created here with different actions. So when you hit enter, it will console.log something different. They have different colors on them. But each of the button is like when it receives focus, it's scaling up. And you can see it in action. So we're moving between them. I can hit enter, which we won't see much. I think the favorite is the only one. No, that doesn't actually change the label either. But all of them will just console.log when you click the action. But here we have a for loop, which is going through creating each of the buttons. So we get a button, we create the button, passing in the button.color and the on enter, which is the button action. So this is what will happen when you hit enter. And then there's a different label for each of those. I think that's pretty clear. You'll also notice the new component is the row component. And this one is very powerful. There's row and column. And the difference between row and column, row is horizontal, column is vertical. So we have our buttons laid out here horizontally, and I am pressing the left and right keyboard, and it's automatically changing focus from the first element, the second element, to the next element, to the next element. That is what the row component does. It is a flex container that also handles on left and on right key presses to change focus between its children. You'll notice that there are 4 buttons here, and when I'm pressing left and right, it's just changing focus between them. And the row component has like an on selected change callback handler, has a few other nice things that you can check out at the Solid UI repository. But I highly recommend you're going to be using row and column a lot. And I think for kicks and giggles, let's just try doing column here real quick. And it should just change it to vertical. You have to import column. So that, yeah, so now it took our same buttons, and rather being flex direction row, it's now flex direction column, and now I can press up and down to switch between our buttons. So that's all that column does. If you don't want flex, you can just say display equals block, and that way now they're all stacked on top of each other because there's no flex and it's not actually changing the Y values of each of the buttons. And to be clear, that is how flex works, right? Is what it's doing is it says, hey, I have all these buttons. I'm going to change the Y value on each of those. So if you were to say like, well, I want this Y button at 50 or 250, like that's not going to happen. It's going to overwrite that value. So just be mindful of that. If you're working inside of a flex container, it's manipulating the X and Y values, so you can't set it. But what you can do is, let's say you want the second button to be a little bit off, you can set margin top to change where these start. And you'll notice actually now each of these have a margin top, so they're spaced out a little bit more. So those are ways to change individual elements, and you can do that by using index. If you wanted only index 0 or 1 to do it, then you can use index, which is part of the for. I'm going to go through that with this video, but there's a lot of features for the for loop that is available in SolidJS. And I think with that, I've covered basically everything that I covered in the article. We talked a little bit about focus. We talked a little bit about the key navigation, how this works. I hope this was a useful video. And like I said, look forward to more coming in the future. And thank you for tuning in.